Hello and welcome to my Jazz Then versus Now podcast, where I'm going to talk about how jazz has changed so much throughout the years, and what it is today is much different than what it was back then. So to start off, I'm going to basically just give a long timeline of all the jazz that has happened all the way back since the late 19th century. But it dates back all the way back to 1619 when Africans became slaves and were taken from Africa because jazz is originated from black culture. So we fast forward 200 years from 1619 when the first African Americans became slaves. We fast forward to 1817 when the Congo Square was made in New Orleans, which was this square area in New Orleans where slaves could make music if they wanted to. And this is kind of the start of it, I guess. And 1865, obviously, Civil War, slavery is abolished. And then to get to the music, in 1892, ragtime starts on the come up. Names like Scott Joplin and Jelly Roll Morton become musicians for that time, playing songs like The Entertainer, which Scott Joplin published in 1902. Created on ragtime is basically like sort of a marching band style of playing, very do, if that makes sense. Again, The Entertainer by Scott Joplin is a perfect example of what ragtime was. The popularity in the early 20th century, the popularity of ragtime grew, and it brought black people and white people together in a sense because they were interacting and listening to this music. 1913, the word jazz is first seen in print, and 2 years later Billie Holiday is born, which is one of the greatest jazz vocalists of all time. And as we get into the 20s, the Harlem Renaissance are starting, which involves black people from the South moving up north, establishing new lives. And Louis Armstrong, the man I said before, starts to rise and becomes America's first pop star. In 1923, the Cotton Club, which is based in New York, was established, and African Americans could perform in front of white people, which was a big deal, but black people couldn't listen to the music being performed. In 1926, the Savoy Ballroom, also known as the home of the Happy Feet, opens and becomes very popular throughout the swing area. The bands there played swing mainly because of the dancers or the people with happy feet. There was a story that goes that on a really crowded night, if you're not dancing but you stand in the middle of a huge crowd, the floor will move under you just because of all of the people jumping around. And there's a song by Benny Goodman, who was referred to as the king of jazz, or the king of swing, made a song called Stompin' at the Savoy, just because everyone's just boom, 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 ba-doom, ba-doom, swinging and stuff. And in 1927, Duke Ellington begins his residency at the Cotton Club, which is basically where he started and got his big stardom. In the 30s, the swing era begins, and jazz is moving out of New Orleans a lot more and into places like New York City and Chicago. And basically the swing era means swing. So swing is like obviously a type of jazz, mainly in big bands. So like you'd have like Beloit Memorial Jazz Orchestra, where they'd have like 5 saxophones, 4, like 3 trombones, some trumpets, and a rhythm section. But swing, it would be like do do ba do do ba do do ba do ba do. Like it kind of swings boom boom ba doom boom ba doom, if that makes sense. And time goes on, and we get to around 1945, near the end of like World War II or whatever. Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker are kind of known for creating bebop, which is like a faster tempo. It gives the musicians lots of room to improvise. So it's basically these musicians just showing off what they can do. So they'll just go like, they'll create these really long lines, or just lines of notes that they play that fits in the chord changes, just to prove like how good they are. So like sort of just stuff like that. And then we go about 5 years later into the 50s. There's cool jazz, which its biggest like name is like Miles Davis. So if you've ever listened to Miles Davis, you can hear it's slower, more relaxed tempos compared to bebop for sure. And then 60s, some jazz legends have died off, but you hear John Coltrane comes and he creates like a free jazz, which is hard to interpret based off what I was looking up, but it's kind of just like not bebop because it's not as quick, but it gives the musicians tons of room to improvise and do what they want on top of these chord changes. And then we get into really modern jazz, like the 70s and the 80s, and it gets more funky and more like rock and rolly, if that makes sense. Herbie Hancock was a big name in this area. He was a saxophone player. He would play quick lines over stuff, but it's definitely more electric, and you can hear it in that area. Now in like the 2000s, jazz hasn't really evolved into another like era, I would say. It sort of became more kind of like a thing of like jazz and pop would go together. Jazz would be in other genres rather than jazz creating a whole new form. Now the jazz then and now conversation comes up. As you can see, there's so many different eras and just parts of jazz that then is kind of just like a broad word. Like when's then? It could have been the 40s when you're talking about bebop and the later big band era, or you're talking about like the early 20s or something, when you're there, the more jazz is more ragtimey, Dixieland type feel. So you take all these different areas into consideration. Jazz then versus now is very different. Some can argue that all jazz has been the same because of its roots are the same, which I would consider like the roots being like blues. Blues is in everything. The blues is incorporated in jazz, country, rock. The blues are what evolved jazz, and again, all these genres to what they are today. So that could be something that hasn't changed, although having one similarity all throughout time doesn't mean it hasn't changed and evolved. Because again, you take swing and then you take bebop, and they are completely different, but they also have still, again, some of those same aspects. Like bebop does swing, but then big band era swing, quote unquote swing era music also obviously swings to like bebop can though as well. So there are common similarities. And then we take it all the way to now, like right now, 2022. Man, there's many different interpretations of jazz now rather than one popular era. So like in the 40s, everyone was listening to big band music. Late 40s, early 50s, everyone was probably getting into the Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, quick, fast, bebop music. And then you go to the 70s, everyone's listening to that funky jazz type music. But now it's more of a collective interpretation of what you want jazz to be or what you like the most. Because personally, I like the older jazz, which is more, or the older jazz, I guess, literally more swing era, some bebop, a little bit of cool jazz. But once you get into the funky stuff, that's not contemporary funky music, that's not really my space. But there also are people today that love the funky stuff, and the big band stuff just really isn't their cup of tea. So I think today it's just less of one little era that everyone likes and more of just a huge genre of all these people that like the genre but different parts of it, if that makes sense. So now I'm gonna do this activity where I'm gonna try to get you to guess which song would probably pop up in the swing era rather than any other era. So I'm gonna play two songs and you're gonna decide which one would more likely be in the big band swing era than, let's say, some song might be in cool jazz era of jazz music. Now you sort of see the difference between these two songs, or those 6 songs, but each two you can kind of see the difference and which one would fall where. So yeah, I think jazz then versus now. Back then, it was its own little thing, be it Dixieland, or back then it was big band, swinging, jumping around a dancing hall, a big ballroom hall, or back then in a bar with a group of 5 people, improvising and expressing their own ideas over some chord changes, or back then playing to a funky beat and improvising over this funky electronic sounding jazz, compared to now where you could be swinging your heart out in a big band chart with a group of other people, or you would be in a little group, or you'd be in a funky group. Again, now it's, rather than more being in its own little area, jazz is a huge ball of just jazziness, rather than a little cubular space of a specific point in time where jazz was once a certain sound, I guess, if that makes sense. So jazz is different then and now because it has changed so much over time, and now everyone plays everything that's been created funky or big band or cooler, compared to back then when it was a trend to play a certain type. Again, these eras. So as time went on, there'd be different trends, and now it's just everyone plays everything. Apart from the literal music, the culture of jazz has definitely changed too. Like back in the big band swing dance era or whatever, everyone listened to jazz as their form of dancing. Now people listen to like rap music or all sorts of other genres as their sort of dancing popular form. But back then, jazz was the rap of this day and age, I guess. And now, today, there's a less popular group of people that listen to it, but there is still a large group, and it's could be considered a lot of old people, but then that's not true because there are also a bunch of young people just like me who listen to it. It's just not as common as all Americans to listen to jazz and go out to dance at the club while listening to jazz. You're gonna hear more rappy, bumpy, like songs nowadays compared to back then.
Mr. Saturday Dance, they crowded the floor. It's awfully different without you. Don't get around much anymore. Thought I'd visit the club, got as far as the door. I couldn't bear it without you. Don't get around much anymore.